Mr. President, with deep feeling of sorrow, I joined the Security Council in strongly condemning the terrorist attack of yesterday in Nice. I express my deep sympathies and condolences to the families of the victims, to the government of France, to the people of France. Mr. President, the recent strategic victories against ISIL in Fallujah and Qayyara and progress in cutting off ISIL forces in Hawija have once again proved that Iraqis are capable of defeating Daesh with support of the international community. Following the liberation of Fallujah, Prime Minister Abadi sent senior delegations to provide briefings on Iraq's progress against Daesh to a number of states, notably to the Gulf Cooperation Council members, with an invitation to join forces in the fight against this increasingly global threat to international peace and security. The need for cooperation and mutual support has never been more apparent. As you mentioned, hundreds of civilians were killed in a spate of attacks attributed to ISIL in Iraq, Turkey, Bangladesh, and Saudi Arabia. Mr. President, progress against Daesh has now put liberation of Mosul strongly on the agenda. As preparations continue with increased focus and acceleration, a point of importance for us is that Prime Minister Abadi has prioritized UN-supported humanitarian operations and has requested the international community to urgently provide the necessary financing. Together with planning the military aspects, the government and the local actors need to accelerate political planning for the day after the liberation, addressing the issues of governance, law and order, and political management of Mosul and the rest of Nineveh. I note the increased cooperation between Baghdad and Erbil and encourage continued efforts to this end. Also, any international assistance must be fully coordinated with the government of Iraq and must respect the principle of sovereignty of Iraq. Mr. President, on the 28th of June, the Federal Supreme Court ruled that the parliamentary sessions of the 14th and 26th of April were nullified. This decision means that the situation reverts to the pre-14th April status quo, with Speaker Al-Jubouri maintaining his position, while the 5 ministerial appointments of the 26th of April session need to be revisited. The Parliament returned from recess and held its plenary sessions on the 12th and 13th of July. Also today, tens of thousands of supporters of Syed Muqtada al-Sadr demonstrated in Baghdad in support of reforms, security, and against corruption. In the past weeks, protests against the government have also emerged in response to deteriorated security situation in Baghdad in the wake of the terrorist attacks, notably in Karada on the 3rd of July, that victimized hundreds of civilians, a barbaric act that all of us condemned in strongest possible terms. Of concern are repeated calls, supported by many politicians, to conduct, in retaliation, executions of those convicted of terrorist attacks. Mr. President, the need for Iraqi political and community leaders, and in particular the Council of Representatives, to prioritize reconciliation based on a single vision and coordinated approach remains a matter of considerable urgency to ensure that the post-Daesh phase in Iraq's history be more stable, secure, and prosperous than in the past. Sustainable peace and security can be achieved only with a historic compromise that will put an end to the divisive policies of intolerance, inequality, and of political and social injustice. I continue to call on the government to also take specific steps to promote women's rights, their participation in politics and national reconciliation processes as part of the reform process, as well as to support the victims of conflict-based sexual violence more effectively. Mr. President, in the Fallujah operation, the government gave an unprecedented priority to protection of lives and dignity of civilians. military assisted civilians in identifying safe escape routes, facilitated extraction of civilians from war zones. A week into the operation, the Prime Minister announced that the battle would be slowed to better ensure the safety of civilians trapped inside the city and used by ISIL as human shields. This made a difference. Nearly 90,000 civilians took the decision to leave and have made it to safety under some of the most difficult and perilous conditions imaginable. Notwithstanding all of this, since the announcement of the Fallujah military operation on the 22nd of May, UNAMI has received credible reports of human rights violations and crimes, including torture and killings, disappearances, and other allegations of mistreatment of those detained committed by elements of the Popular Mobilization Forces and the Iraqi security forces operating in the Fallujah area, notably during the initial phases of the operation. For example, UNAMI has registered statements supporting claims that 95 men remaining unaccounted for after they were intercepted by forces affiliated to PMF while leaving their homes in Al-Sijar area on the 25th of May, whilst another 643 men, including boys, remain missing since the 5th of June after they were intercepted by PMF-affiliated forces while leaving Saklavia. On the 6th of June, Prime Minister Abadi announced the creation of a committee to investigate violations and crimes. In my meeting with Prime Minister Abadi last Monday, I reiterated the message delivered to the Prime Minister by Secretary General in his telephone call on the 26th of June, that it is imperative that the committee takes swift action to identify the whereabouts of these missing men and boys and to secure their safe release or transfer them to lawful government authorities. The authorities must hold accountable any individual who may have been responsible for any violations that have been committed. Also, these lessons from Fallujah shall be taken into account when planning liberation of Mosul. Mr. President, a newly published UNICEF report reveals that the number of children in danger of death, injury, sexual violence, abduction and recruitment into armed groups in Iraq has increased by 1.3 million in 18 months. I urge the government of Iraq to establish as soon as possible a high-level interministerial committee to ensure coordination and dialogue between the government of Iraq and the UN on all issues regarding grave violations of children's rights. Mr. President, the retaking of Fallujah should not cast doubt on the remaining ability of ISIL to conduct devastating attacks in different areas of the country, despite its consistent losses of manpower, command structure, morale, local support and territory. While the Daesh's governance project in Iraq is collapsing, it has increasingly resorted to brutal insurgency tactics using suicide bombers. The pattern of reinvigorated urban terrorism with sectarian focus, notably attacks against civilian targets and infrastructure in Baghdad, is indicative of this trend. Luckily, so far, they have failed in their efforts to reignite sectarian confrontation. Providing and guaranteeing law and order and security to all citizens of Iraq is a top responsibility of the respective state organs and institutions and must remain their prerogative. With the progress in fighting Daesh, reforming Iraqi security institutions, and ensuring that the state has full control of all armed groups becomes a priority. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation has deteriorated further since the start of the military operation for Fallujah, with 640,000 currently displaced in Anbar governorate alone. Nationwide, more than 10 million Iraqis require some form of humanitarian assistance, including 3.4 million people who have been displaced since the rise of ISIL in 2014. The humanitarian appeal, though, for 2016 requested 865 million US dollars, and as I stand before you today, it is only funded at 38%. A reallocation of existing resources is underway, but more funding is urgently needed, not only for the current emergency response, but also for the anticipated requirements arising from the Mosul liberation campaign, where the humanitarian effort could cost as much as $1 billion. OCHA estimates that the Mosul operation will be largest and most sensitive humanitarian crisis in the world in 2016. And it is vital that resources are made available now to make timely preparations possible. The impact of underfunding on the crisis in Iraq is significant. Patience of host communities is disappearing. Distrust in the government is growing. Prospects for stability and reconciliation after ISIL are put at risk. UN efforts to help stabilize areas newly liberated from ISIL are expanding. This includes Ramadi and soon also Fallujah. Stabilization efforts can only expand further after the threat of improvised explosive devices and explosive remnants of war has been addressed. UNMAS is working in Iraq with partners to address explosive contamination. It also urgently requires financing of a minimum of $300 million over the next 3 years. Mr. President, as regards the Kuwaiti file, I would like to welcome the new dynamics, determination and political will to achieve results that the Iraqi Ministry of Defense has shown since taking over the technical overview of the missing Kuwaiti persons file. New momentum was also evident in the efforts of the Iraqi Ministry of Foreign Affairs to locate the missing Kuwaiti property. Thousands of Kuwaiti books are being prepared for official handover to the government of Kuwait. During his recent visit to Kuwait on the 26th of June, the Secretary General, in his meeting with the Emir of the State of Kuwait, commended Kuwait for its consistent support for Iraq, while he reconfirmed the UN's continuing resolve to see progress on the file. The government of Iraq, in turn, has to abide by its international obligations and strive to achieve concrete results on this very important file. Mr. President, the world must recognize that Iraq requires more, not less, international support at this critical juncture. The pledging conference organized in support of Iraq in Washington on the 20th of July is a sign of the international community's continued commitment for a stable and peaceful Iraq and its recognition of the sacrifices Iraq and its people bear in fighting terrorist Daesh. While the international community is ready to offer assistance, Iraqis must implement substantive, in particular economic, institutional and anti-corruption reforms that will put their country on the road to recovery and improve the lives of Iraqis. People demand genuine change. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Kubiš for his briefing. I now give the floor to the representative